The air in the Duchess of Pemberley's ballroom was a thick, cloying thing, heavy with the scent of wilting lilies and beeswax. Lady Annalise Finch stood near a marble column, the cool stone a comfort against the silk of her glove. At 40 years of age, she had become more of a fixture than a guest at such events, a piece of elegant, overlooked furniture. The whispers followed her like a draught, subtle but persistent. Poor Annalise! Such a shame. Quite past it now, of course. She had learned long ago to arrange her features into a mask of serene indifference, a placid lake beneath which the currents of humiliation and quiet sorrow ran deep. Her dress, a respectable gown of dove-grey silk, had been refashioned for the third time. The Finch fortune, once robust, had withered like an autumn leaf, and this charade of belonging was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. She watched the younger ladies, bright as butterflies, flit across the polished floor in the arms of dashing young men. They were the present, the future. She was a relic of the past, a story whose final chapter had seemingly been written years ago, the spinster. Her gaze drifted, as it often did, to the man who commanded the room, without ever seeming to move. Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood. He stood near the grand fireplace, a figure carved from shadow and ice. He was not old, perhaps a year or two her senior, but he possessed an ageless, formidable stillness. His hair was the color of a raven's wing, his features sharp and aristocratic, yet his eyes were the color of a winter sky and held just as much warmth. He had been a widower for 5 years, and since the death of his Duchess, he had become London's most eligible and most unapproachable man. He did not dance, he did not smile. He spoke in clipped, precise sentences, his presence a pocket of cold in the overheated ballroom. Annalise had never spoken to him, had never been closer than 20 feet, yet she felt she understood something of the profound grief that encased him. She saw it in the rigid set of his shoulders, the way he held his wine glass as if it were a weapon, the utter absence of light in his expression. Society saw a prize to be won. She saw a fortress of sorrow. A nervous cough at her elbow startled her from her reverie. It was her father, Baron Finch, his face pale and etched with a worry that had become its permanent companion. "Annalise," he murmured, his eyes darting about as if expecting a creditor to materialize from behind a potted palm. "We should be making our way home." She nodded, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. The fine wool of his coat felt thin beneath her fingers. "Of course, father." The journey home in the rattling carriage was a silent one, the gaslights of London smeared against the windows, painting fleeting, ghostly streaks in the darkness. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy with unspoken anxieties. Their townhouse in a respectable but fading square felt cavernous and cold upon their return. The fire in the drawing-room grate had been banked low, a sad, glowing heart in the gloom. Her father did not retire. Instead, he paced before the hearth, his hands clasped so tightly behind his back that his knuckles were white. Annalise waited, her own heart a slow, heavy drum in her chest. She knew this prelude. It was the quiet before the storm of another financial revelation. Finally, he stopped and turned to face her, his expression one of utter defeat. "It is over, Annalise," he said, his voice cracking. "The last of the investments gone. Mr. Henderson called in the final marker this afternoon. We are ruined." The word hung in the air between them, stark and absolute. Ruined. It was not a distant threat anymore, a wolf howling on the horizon. It was in the room with them, its breath cold on their necks. Annalise felt a strange calm settle over her. She had been anticipating this for so long that its arrival felt less like a shock and more like a final, grim acceptance. "What will we do?" she asked, her voice even. Her father sank into a chair, his face in his hands. "I do not know. Sell the house, I suppose. Dismiss the staff. Move to some dreadful little cottage in the country where no one knows our name. Your name." His shoulders shook with a dry sob. "I have failed you, my dear. I have squandered your inheritance, your future, your dowry. It is because of me that you are—" He couldn't say the word. "Spinster. Alone." Annalise went to him, kneeling on the threadbare rug beside his chair. She took one of his trembling hands in hers. "You have not failed me, father. You have done your best. These are difficult times." Her words were a balm, but she knew they were not the truth. The truth was a tapestry of poor decisions and misplaced trust. A story she had watched unfold with helpless clarity. They sat like that for a long time, the dying embers of the fire casting long shadows on the wall. Two souls adrift on a sea of debt. The prospect of a small cottage of obscurity did not frighten Annalise as much as the shame that would crush her father. He was a man who lived and breathed by the tenets of society, by name and reputation. To lose that would be a death of a different kind. 2 days later, a crisp, cream-colored envelope arrived, delivered by a footman in a livery of black and silver. The seal was the ducal crest of Blackwood. Annalise's breath caught in her throat as she watched her father break the wax. His hands trembled so violently she feared he would tear the heavy parchment. He read the single, brief sheet, his eyes widening. He read it again, then a third time, as if unable to comprehend the words written in a severe black script. "He has summoned me," her father whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of terror and awe. "The Duke of Blackwood, he requests my presence at his London residence this afternoon on a matter of some urgency." The Duke? Annalise felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "But why? We barely know him." "I have no idea," her father said, sinking into a chair. "Perhaps he has heard of our situation. Perhaps it is about the lands bordering his northern estate. Oh, Annalise, what if he means to call in a debt I have forgotten? You have no debts with the Duke, father. Calm yourself." But she could not calm the frantic beating of her own heart. The Duke of Blackwood was a man of immense power and influence. He did not do things without reason, and for him to summon a minor, failing baron, it made no sense. Her father went, of course. He spent an hour with his valet, ensuring his best, albeit slightly worn, suit was perfectly pressed. He left in a hired cab, a man walking towards a future he could not possibly predict. Annalise spent the next 3 hours in a state of suspended animation. She tried to read, but the words blurred. She tried to busy herself with household accounts, but the columns of figures swam before her eyes. She sat by the window in the drawing room, watching the hands of the clock on the mantelpiece creep forward with agonizing slowness. When the cab returned, her father emerged, looking dazed, as if he had been struck by lightning. He walked into the house, handed his hat and gloves to the butler without a word, and proceeded directly to the drawing room. He poured himself a brandy, his hand shaking so much that the crystal decanter rattled against the glass. He drank it in one go. "Father," Annalise prompted gently, what is it? What did he want?" He looked at her, truly looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a wild, unreadable emotion. "He knows, Annalise. He knows everything about our finances, to the last shilling. How could he possibly? He is the Duke of Blackwood," her father said, as if that explained everything. "He has an offer, a solution to all our problems." He paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "A proposition." Annalise waited, her posture rigid. "He wishes to marry you." The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 4, each stroke a hammer blow against the sudden ringing silence in the room. Annalise stared at her father, certain she had misheard. "Marry me?" The words felt foreign in her mouth, absurd. The Duke of Blackwood, the most sought-after man in England, wanted to marry her, the invisible 40-year-old spinster with no dowry and a ruined family. "It is a business arrangement," her father rushed to explain, his words tumbling over one another. "That is what he called it, a contract. He requires a duchess, a woman of impeccable breeding, of quiet temperament and maturity, someone to act as mistress of his household, and most importantly, as a mother to his daughter, Lady Rosamond." Annalise had forgotten the child, a pale, silent little girl she had only glimpsed once or twice in the park, always in the company of a stern-faced governess. "He was very clear," her father continued, avoiding her eyes. "He said he has no interest in the frivolities of a youthful bride. He does not seek a love match. He seeks stability, order. He said he has observed you in society, and you possess the dignity and discretion he requires." Observed her? Annalise felt a fresh wave of cold. She had thought herself invisible, but she had been under the scrutiny of those piercing winter sky eyes. He had been assessing her, not as a woman, but as a potential asset. "In return," her father said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "he will settle all our debts, every last one. He will provide you with a generous personal allowance and restore the Finch name. We would be saved, Annalise." Saved. The word was a lifeline, but it was attached to an anchor that would pull her down into the cold, unknown depths of a life with a man who was a stranger. A man who offered a title and security, but explicitly denied the possibility of affection. "He wishes to speak with you himself," her father concluded, finally looking at her. "Tomorrow. He made it clear that the decision is yours alone, but, Annalise," his gaze was pleading, "think of what this means." She thought of it all night. She lay awake in her bed, staring into the darkness, the grey light of dawn already beginning to seep through the curtains before she closed her eyes. She thought of a life of continued decline, of watching her father wither under the weight of his shame. She thought of a cramped cottage, of loneliness, of the pitying glances that would follow her even into obscurity. Then she thought of the alternative, a life of immense wealth and privilege, but a life devoid of warmth, a marriage that was a mere transaction, to be the wife of a man who looked at her as a solution to a problem. Could she endure such a cold existence? She had endured 40 years of being overlooked, of managing her own quiet disappointments. Perhaps endurance was her greatest skill. The next day she dressed with meticulous care, not in the hopeful finery of a debutante, but in the sober armor of a woman facing a negotiation. She chose a dress of deep forest green, a color that spoke of resilience, not romance. Her loyal maid, Elspeth, styled her hair with gentle, knowing hands, her silence more comforting than any words of false encouragement could have been. Blackwood House was an imposing stone fortress on the most fashionable square in London, a statement of unassailable power. It made their own townhouse seem like a doll's house. A severe butler led her through a cavernous hall of black and white marble, the silence broken only by the echo of her own footsteps. It felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. The Duke was waiting for her in his study. It was a room of dark wood, leather-bound books, and masculine austerity. There were no personal effects, no clutter, only order and shadow. He stood as she entered, a tall, unyielding figure against the light of the tall window. He did not smile. "Lady Annalise," he said, his voice a low baritone, as devoid of inflection as she remembered. "Thank you for coming." He gestured to a leather chair opposite his vast mahogany desk. She sat, her back straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She would not show him any sign of the turmoil that raged within her. He remained standing, looking down at her, not with contempt, but with the detached appraisal of a connoisseur examining a piece of art. "I trust your father has conveyed the substance of my proposal." "He has, Your Grace." "Good. I value efficiency. I will be direct, as I believe in clarity above all else. My life is one of order and duty. I have a daughter, Rosamond, who requires a mother's influence. My estates require a duchess to manage their domestic affairs. I require a hostess who can perform her duties with grace and without drama." The slight pause before the last word was freighted with meaning. "I have no time for or interest in the emotional entanglements that typically accompany marriage," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "I offer you my name, my protection, and complete financial security for you and your family. Your duties would be to manage this house and my country seat, to act as a mother to my child, and to appear at my side when society dictates. In all other respects, our lives would be separate. You would have your own rooms, your own pursuits. I would expect fidelity and discretion. In return, I would offer you the same." It was the coldest, most passionless declaration a woman could ever hope to hear. He was offering her a cage, albeit a beautifully gilded one. He was not just marrying her, he was hiring her. Annalise met his gaze, her own calm and steady. She had made her decision in the sleepless hours of the night. Her life was already a barren landscape. He was merely offering to irrigate it with gold instead of tears. "And your daughter, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice clear. "Does she know of this arrangement?" A flicker of something, surprise, annoyance, crossed his features before being suppressed. "Rosamond is a child. She will be told that I am to remarry. It is my hope that you will provide her with the stability she has lacked." "And what if she does not take to me?" Annalise pressed, needing to understand the full scope of her appointed task. "You are a woman of maturity, and I am told of some sense. I trust you will manage," he said dismissively, as if discussing the hiring of a new governess. The coldness of it settled into her bones, a deep, permanent chill. This would be her life, a marriage of convenience in its starkest form. No pretense of affection, no hope of companionship, just duty. She thought of her father's broken face. She thought of the whispers, the pity, the slow, grinding erosion of their dignity. She could stop it all. She could trade her heart for their salvation. It did not feel like a choice at all, but an inevitability. She rose from her chair, a figure of quiet dignity in her forest green dress. She looked the formidable Duke of Blackwood in the eye. "Your terms are clear, Your Grace," she said, "and I accept them." For the first time, a genuine, though fleeting expression crossed his face. It was one of pure, unadulterated relief. The great Duke of Blackwood had solved his problem, and Annalise Lady Finch had just become the solution. The wedding was a swift, perfunctory affair held in the private chapel at Blackwood House. It was attended by only a handful of people, her father looking bewildered and relieved in equal measure, the Duke's solicitor, and a stern-faced elderly woman who was introduced as his aunt, Lady Agatha, and who inspected Annalise as if she were a horse whose teeth were suspect. There were no flowers, save for a single austere arrangement of white lilies on the altar. Annalise wore a simple traveling suit of deep blue velvet. There was no veil, no joyous celebration. It was the signing of a contract, sanctified by a nervous-looking clergyman. When Alistair placed the heavy gold band on her finger, his touch was cold and impersonal, his vows spoken in the same monotone he had used to outline their arrangement. Annalise repeated her own vows in a clear, steady voice, feeling a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a play in which she was merely an actor. When the clergyman pronounced them man and wife, there was an awkward pause. The Duke did not kiss her. He simply offered his arm, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Your Grace," he said, the title a formal acknowledgement of her new station. And with that, the Duchess of Blackwood was made. The journey to Blackwood Manor, the Duke's country seat in the north, began an hour later. They travelled in his private carriage, a magnificent vehicle sprung for comfort and upholstered in dark leather that smelled of polish and old money. They sat opposite one another, the silence stretching between them like a vast, empty plain. The Duke read a sheaf of papers pertaining to one of his many business interests, his brow furrowed in concentration. He did not speak to her for the first 3 hours. Annalise watched the rolling hills of the English countryside slide past the window. The sky was a painter's palette of greys, a low-hanging mist clinging to the valleys. Pathetic fallacy, she thought with a flicker of wry amusement. The weather certainly matched the climate inside the carriage. She studied her new husband from beneath her lashes. He was, she had to admit, a handsome man in a severe, classical way. The lines of his face were clean and strong, his profile worthy of a Roman coin, but it was a beauty devoid of warmth, like a perfectly sculpted marble statue. There was no softness in him, no hint of vulnerability. He was a fortress, and she had just been granted access to the outermost courtyard, with no hope of ever reaching the keep. She wondered about the woman who had come before her, Isabella, the late Duchess. Society gossip, which Annalise had always tried to ignore, painted her as a great beauty, a vibrant, laughing creature who had been the sun to his moon. What had happened to extinguish that light? The official story was a sudden, tragic illness, but Annalise had always sensed there was more to it, a darker, unspoken truth that was locked away with the Duke's heart. As dusk began to settle, tinting the grey sky with strokes of lavender and bruised purple, he finally put his papers aside. "We will arrive within the hour," he stated, not as a point of conversation, but as a delivery of information. "The housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, has been with the family for 30 years. She is efficient. The staff are well trained. You will find everything in order." "And your daughter?" Annalise asked, her voice quiet. "Rosamond will be in the nursery. Her governess is Miss Albright. You may make her acquaintance in the morning. I thought it best to allow the child to adjust to your presence gradually." He was managing her arrival as he would the introduction of a new piece of furniture. Annalise merely nodded, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. It was one thing to agree to a loveless marriage with a man. It was another entirely to be presented as a mother to a grieving child who had not asked for her. The carriage turned off the main road, passing through a set of imposing wrought-iron gates bearing the Blackwood crest. A long, winding drive flanked by ancient skeletal oak trees led them towards the house. And then she saw it. Blackwood Manor was not a house. It was a sprawling Gothic masterpiece of grey stone, its many turrets and gables piercing the twilight sky like jagged teeth. It was magnificent, imposing, and utterly without welcome. Lights glowed in only a few of the dozens of mullioned windows, making the vast structure seem more like a sleeping beast than a home. When the carriage drew to a halt, a footman sprang to open the door. Alistair disembarked first, then turned and offered her his hand. His grip was firm and brief. As she stepped onto the gravel, the great oak doors of the manor swung open, spilling a rectangle of pale yellow light into the encroaching darkness. A line of servants stood in the grand entrance hall, their faces impassive. At their head was a tall, severe-looking woman with iron-grey hair pulled into a tight bun, Mrs. Gable. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said, her voice crisp as starched linen, inclining her head first to the Duke, then with a flicker of curiosity to Annalise. "Mrs. Gable," Alistair acknowledged, "this is the Duchess. You will see to her needs." He turned to Annalise. "Your rooms are in the east wing. They were my mother's. I trust you will find them comfortable. Dinner is at 8. I have work to attend to in my study." And with that he strode past the line of servants and disappeared down a long, dark corridor, leaving her standing alone in the vast, echoing hall, the object of a dozen curious stares. She was the new Duchess, the mistress of this great house, and she'd never felt more like an interloper in her life. Mrs. Gable stepped forward. "This way, Your Grace." Her tone was perfectly respectful, yet Annalise sensed a deep reserve, a wait-and-see attitude. She was being weighed and measured by the woman who truly ran this house. Annalise followed her up a grand, sweeping staircase, her footsteps silent on the thick crimson runner. The walls were lined with portraits of Blackwood ancestors, their stern, painted eyes following her progress. The air was still and cold, carrying the faint, clean scent of beeswax and something else, something like old stone and forgotten sorrows. The Duchess's apartments were a suite of rooms, opulent and immaculate. A large sitting room with a fireplace, a spacious bedchamber dominated by a vast four-poster bed draped in heavy damask, and a well-appointed dressing room. Everything was perfect, polished, and utterly impersonal. There was no trace of the woman who had lived here before her, Alistair's mother. It was a beautiful, sterile set of rooms, a luxurious prison cell. Her own maid, Elspeth, was already there, unpacking her modest trunks. The sight of a familiar, friendly face was so welcome that Annalise felt a lump form in her throat. "Oh, my lady, your grace," Elspeth said, curtsying quickly. It's very grand, isn't it?" Her eyes were wide with awe and a little fear. "It is," Annalise agreed, sinking onto a silk-upholstered chaise longue. "Very grand, Elspeth, and very cold." That evening, Annalise met the final piece of her new life, Lady Beatrice Croft, the sister of the late Duchess. She was waiting for them in the formal drawing-room before dinner, a striking woman with hair the colour of burnished copper and eyes a sharp, intelligent green. She was dressed in fashionable mourning, a gown of black silk that managed to be both sombre and alluring. She had, Annalise knew, made herself indispensable in the household since her sister's death, acting as hostess and unofficial guardian of her niece. "Your Grace," Beatrice said, her voice smooth as cream as she executed a perfect curtsy. She looked Annalise up and down, a swift, comprehensive assessment. "Welcome to Blackwood. We are all so surprised. Alistair is ever a man of swift decisions." The compliment was laced with a delicate, unmistakable barb. Dinner was a torturous affair. The three of them sat at a dining table that could have seated 30, the vast expanse of polished mahogany between them, an ocean of silence. The Duke spoke little, directing a few perfunctory questions to Beatrice about the estate, and none at all to Annalise. Beatrice, however, kept up a steady stream of conversation, a monologue filled with references to dear Isabella, stories of her childhood with her sister, and fond anecdotes about her niece, Rosamond. Every word was a carefully placed stone, building a wall around the memory of the first Duchess, a wall designed to exclude Annalise. "Rosamond is such a sensitive child," Beatrice said, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. "So like her mother, she feels things so very deeply. One must be terribly careful not to upset the delicate balance of her world." The warning was clear. "Tread carefully. You are not wanted here." Annalise simply listened, her expression calm, offering polite, non-committal responses when required. She would not be drawn into a battle of wits with this woman. She had not agreed to this marriage to fight for her position. She had agreed to it to endure. After dinner, the Duke excused himself again, retreating to his study as if fleeing a tedious obligation. Annalise was left with Lady Beatrice, who smiled a tight, predatory smile. "I do hope you will be happy here, Your Grace," she said, the title dripping with condescension. "It is a quiet life. Alistair is not one for entertainment, and the house, well, it holds its memories very close." "I am not afraid of quiet, Lady Beatrice," Annalise replied, her voice even. "Nor of memories." Beatrice's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second. "We shall see," she murmured, before wishing Annalise a good night and gliding from the room, leaving Annalise alone in the vast, silent house that was now her home. The next morning, Annalise resolved to meet her new daughter. After a solitary breakfast, she made her way to the nursery wing. Miss Albright, the governess, was a thin, severe woman with a perpetual air of disapproval. And there, sitting at a small table by the window, was Lady Rosamond. She was a small, elfin child of 8, with her father's raven-dark hair and a pale, heart-shaped face. But her eyes were not the winter sky grey of the Duke's. They were a deep, dark brown, wide and shadowed, with a sorrow too large for such a small person. She did not look up when Annalise entered. She simply continued to stare out the window at the drizzling rain. "Lady Rosamond," Annalise said softly. "Good morning. I am Annalise." She did not use a title. Not mother, not duchess, just her name. The little girl did not respond. She gave no sign that she had even heard. Miss Albright sniffed. "Her ladyship is often quiet, Your Grace." Annalise pulled up a small chair and sat near the window, a few feet from the child. She did not try to force conversation. She simply sat, sharing the silence, watching the rain trace patterns on the glass. She stayed for an hour, and in that hour, Rosamond never once looked at her. The days that followed settled into a cold, predictable routine. Annalise would take her meals alone or in strained silence with the Duke and Lady Beatrice. She would spend time in the nursery, a quiet, unobtrusive presence in Rosamond's world. She met with Mrs. Gable each morning, going over menus and household matters, with a calm efficiency that seemed to slowly, grudgingly earn the housekeeper's respect. Her interactions with her husband were limited to brief, formal exchanges at dinner. He never sought her out. He never asked her opinion. They were two strangers living under the same roof, bound by a contract. The east wing was her domain, her sanctuary, but the rest of the house felt like it belonged to the ghosts of the past. One wing of the manor, the west wing, was kept closed. The doors were locked, the furniture shrouded in dust cloths. When she asked Mrs. Gable about it, the housekeeper's face had become a closed, shuttered mask. "The late Duchess's rooms, Your Grace," she had said, her voice clipped. "His Grace ordered them sealed after her death. No one is permitted to enter." It was a physical manifestation of the Duke's heart, a part of his life, his past, locked away, shrouded in dust and sorrow, too painful to be faced. Annalise felt a pang of something she could not name. It was not quite pity, but a deep, resonant empathy for the man who had built such impenetrable walls around himself. She was living in his fortress, and she was beginning to understand the depth of the grief that had laid its foundations. One grey afternoon, feeling restless and confined by the oppressive silence of the manor, Annalise pulled on a thick cloak and went walking in the grounds. The gardens near the house were impeccably manicured, a testament to the efficiency of the Blackwood staff, but as she wandered further from the house, drawn by a crumbling stone wall, half hidden by overgrown ivy, she found something else. It was a rose garden, or what had once been a rose garden. Now it was a tangled, thorny wilderness. The paths were choked with weeds, the trellises were collapsing, and the rose bushes themselves were a chaotic mess of deadwood and leggy, desperate growth. And yet, here and there, a few stubborn blossoms still clung to the thorny branches, their velvet petals in shades of crimson and pale pink, a splash of defiant life in the midst of decay. In the center of the garden was a stone bench, green with moss, and beside it a sundial, its face obscured by lichen. It felt like a secret, forgotten place, a place of profound sadness but also of hidden potential. It mirrored the house. It mirrored the family who lived within it. Annalise reached out and touched a single perfect crimson petal, its surface like cool silk against her fingertips. And, in that moment, a quiet, unshakable resolve settled within her. She had been adrift in this cold, new life, a duchess in name only, with no real purpose. But here was something, here was a task. She would bring this garden back to life. She began the next day. Dressed in an old gardening gown and sturdy gloves she had asked a bewildered Elspeth to find for her, she went to the neglected garden, armed with a pair of shears borrowed from the head gardener, a craggy Scotsman named Mr. MacLeod, who looked at her as if she had grown a second head. "The old Duchess's garden, that is," he'd grunted, his expression dubious. "Ain't no one set foot in there for 5 years. Best left alone, Your Grace." "Nevertheless, Mr. MacLeod, I intend to restore it," she had replied calmly. The work was hard. Her hands, accustomed to embroidery and pouring tea, were soon aching and scratched. She spent hours untangling the thorny brambles, clearing the weeds from the paths, and carefully pruning the dead wood from the gnarled rose bushes. It was methodical, painstaking labor, and she found a strange solace in it. Here, in this forgotten corner of the estate, she could create order from chaos. She could nurture life. Lady Beatrice found her there on the 3rd day, a vision of fashionable elegance standing at the crumbling stone entrance. Her perfectly plucked eyebrows rose in disbelief. "Good heavens, Your Grace!" she exclaimed, her voice laced with mockery. "Are you so bored already that you've taken to playing at being a common gardener?" Annalise, her hands covered in dirt and a smudge of soil on her cheek, simply straightened up and met her gaze. "I find the work satisfying, Lady Beatrice." Isabella adored this garden, Beatrice said, her tone changing, becoming wistful and sharp at the same time. "She designed it herself. Every single bush was chosen by her. It seems a pity to disturb it." "I am not disturbing it," Annalise replied, her voice firm but quiet. "I am tending to it. It has been neglected for too long." Beatrice's smile was thin as a knife's edge. "As you wish. I'm sure Alistair will be fascinated by your new hobby." She turned and walked away, her silk skirts rustling in disapproval. Annalise paid her no mind. She returned to her work, her shears making a satisfying snip as they cut through a dead branch. She knew Beatrice's words were meant to wound, to remind her that she was an outsider, treading on sacred ground. But Annalise felt no guilt. She was not trying to erase Isabella. She was trying to heal a wound in the landscape, a wound that mirrored so many others at Blackwood Manor. Sometimes she would see Rosamond watching her from the nursery window. The child's small pale face was a constant, silent presence. Annalise never called out to her, never waved. She simply continued her work, allowing the child to observe her without pressure. One afternoon, a week into her project, she looked up from her weeding to find Rosamond standing a few feet away, just inside the garden gate. The little girl was clutching a worn-looking doll, her large dark eyes fixed on Annalise's dirt-stained hands. Annalise's heart gave a little lurch, but she kept her movements slow and calm. She did not want to startle her. She simply sat back on her heels and offered a small, gentle smile. "Hello, Rosamond." The child said nothing. She just watched, her expression unreadable. Annalise turned back to the rose bush she was working on, carefully loosening the soil around its base. She began to speak softly, not really to Rosamond, but to the air between them. "This one is called a maiden's blush," she murmured, gesturing to the bush. "You see how the petals are almost white in the center, and then they blush to a pale pink at the edges? When it blooms properly, it will be very beautiful." She worked for another 10 minutes, Rosamond a silent statue at the edge of the garden. Annalise was beginning to think the child would simply turn and leave, when a tiny voice, thin as a thread, broke the silence. "Mama liked the red ones best." Annalise froze, her trowel halfway to the ground. She looked up slowly. Rosamond was looking at a particularly overgrown bush in the corner, a monstrous tangle of thorns that showed no sign of life. "The Ina Harkness," Rosamond whispered. "She said they were the color of a heart." Tears welled in Annalise's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. She would not pity this child. Pity was a useless, condescending emotion. Rosamond deserved respect. "Then we must take special care of that one," Annalise said, her voice gentle but practical, "to make sure it grows strong again. Perhaps you could show me which one it is." For a moment the child hesitated. Then, with painstaking slowness, she took a step, and then another, until she was standing beside Annalise. She pointed a small, hesitant finger at the thorny monster. "That one!" It was the beginning, a fragile, tentative shoot of connection in the barren soil of their lives. From that day on, Rosamond would often join her in the garden. She rarely spoke, but she would sit on the newly cleared stone bench, her doll in her lap, and watch Annalise work. Sometimes she would hand Annalise a tool or point out a beetle crawling on a leaf. They were small, quiet moments, but to Annalise they felt monumental. She was no longer just an observer in the child's life. She was becoming a part of its landscape. The Duke, too, seemed to notice. Annalise was aware of him watching from his study window, which overlooked the garden. He never came down, never commented on her work, but she felt his gaze, a constant, silent scrutiny. What did he think? Did he approve? Did he resent her for disturbing his late wife's sanctuary? His face, as always, gave nothing away. One evening, weeks after she'd begun her work, Annalise was in the garden as dusk fell, reluctant to leave. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and the faint, spicy scent of the roses. She was examining the Ina Harkness bush, which, to her delight, was showing the first signs of new green shoots. A footstep on the gravel path behind her made her turn. It was the Duke. He was standing there, a dark, tall silhouette against the fading light. It was the first time he had ever sought her out, the first time he had approached her outside the formal settings of the dining room or drawing room. Her heart began to beat a little faster. "Your Grace," she said, rising to her feet and wiping her hands on her apron. He did not reply immediately. His gaze swept over the garden, taking in the cleared paths, the heavily pruned bushes, the neat piles of weeds and dead wood. His expression was for once not entirely blank. There was something there, a flicker of surprise, perhaps. He walked over to the bench and ran a hand over the stone, now clean of its thick mossy coat. "My wife, Isabella, she loved this garden," he said, his voice low and rough, as if the words were being pulled from a great depth. "I know," Annalise said softly. "Rosamond told me." He looked at her then, and the intensity of his gaze was startling. "You have spent a great deal of time on this." It was a statement, not a question. "I enjoy it," she replied simply. He walked over to the maiden's blush bush she had first shown Rosamond. He reached out, his long fingers hovering just above a newly formed leaf bud. "My mother planted this one," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She said it reminded her of my grandmother." It was the most personal thing he had ever said to her. A tiny, unguarded glimpse into a past he kept so fiercely locked away. He was not just seeing a tidy garden, he was seeing the ghosts of the women who had tended it before her. He looked from the bush back to her, and for a fleeting second the ice in his eyes seemed to thaw, replaced by something else. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was a grudging respect, an acknowledgement. He was seeing her, not just the convenient duchess he had installed in his home, but the woman who had coaxed life from a place of decay. "The gardeners have complained you are taking their tools," he said, his tone shifting back towards its usual clipped formality. Annalise felt a flush of embarrassment. "I did not wish to be a bother. "I have instructed MacLeod to provide you with a set of your own," he stated, "and to assist you with the heavier work, should you require it." He turned to leave, his customary silence descending once more. But just before he reached the gate, he paused and looked back at her over his shoulder. "It is an improvement," he said, and then he was gone. Annalise stood alone in the twilight, her heart hammering against her ribs. An improvement. From the Duke of Blackwood, it was the highest praise imaginable. It was a single, fragile sunbeam breaking through the heavy grey clouds. It was not a promise of spring, but it was undeniably a glimmer of hope. The fragile truce established in the garden did little to thaw the glacial atmosphere within the manor itself, particularly when Lady Beatrice was present. Seeing the burgeoning connection between Annalise and Rosamond, and the Duke's grudging acknowledgement of his new wife's efforts, Beatrice's subtle hostility began to sharpen. She saw her own influence, so carefully cultivated over 5 years, beginning to wane. Her attacks were never direct, always couched in concern. "Dear Annalise, you must be exhausted," she would say at dinner, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "All that time digging in the dirt. It is hardly ducal. One worries what people will say." Or she would praise the late Duchess's effortless grace, her skill at managing the household, her profound connection with her daughter, all qualities she implied Annalise lacked. Annalise refused to be baited. She met Beatrice's veiled insults with a calm, unruffled politeness that seemed to infuriate the other woman even more. She knew Beatrice was fighting a territorial war for the heart of the household, and Annalise had no intention of engaging on those terms. Her focus was on the garden and on the quiet, sad-eyed little girl who was slowly beginning to trust her. The turning point came on a blustery afternoon in late autumn. Annalise was in the library, a vast 2-story room lined with thousands of books, searching for a particular volume on rose cultivation. She had discovered that Rosamond, though quiet, was an avid listener, and had taken to reading aloud to her in the evenings before bed. The child would sit curled in a large armchair, her face rapt, as Annalise's voice filled the nursery with tales of adventure and myth. She was on a rolling ladder, reaching for a book on a high shelf, when Lady Beatrice swept into the room, her face a mask of controlled fury. "I must have a word with you, Your Grace," she said, her voice tight. Annalise descended the ladder. "Of course, Lady Beatrice. Is something amiss?" "Something is very much amiss," Beatrice snapped, her composure finally cracking. "I have just come from the nursery. Rosamond, she was drawing a picture of you in the garden." Annalise felt a quiet surge of pleasure, but she kept her expression neutral. "Was she?" "Do not play the innocent with me," Beatrice hissed, her green eyes flashing. "I know what you are doing. You are systematically trying to erase my sister's memory. First her garden, now her child. You insinuate yourself into their lives, pretending to be this gentle, nurturing presence. But you are a usurper. I have no desire to erase the memory of your sister," Annalise said, her voice low but firm. "I am merely trying to make a home here for myself and for Rosamond. She is my daughter now, too." "She will never be your daughter." Beatrice's voice rose, echoing in the cavernous library. "You are a barren spinster who bought her way into this family, a cold, unfeeling woman who could never understand the bond between a mother and child. You are trying to replace Isabella, and I will not allow it." The cruelty of the words, barren spinster, struck Annalise with the force of a physical blow. It was the whisper of society, the label she had worn for 2 decades, now weaponized and hurled at her with venom. For a moment she could not breathe. All the years of quiet pain, of longing for a family of her own, of accepting her fate with dignity, coalesced into a single sharp point of agony. But then she looked at Beatrice's contorted face, and she saw not just malice, but a desperate, possessive grief. This woman had lost her sister, and she was terrified of losing the last piece of her that remained, her niece. Annalise's pain was instantly tempered by a wave of unexpected compassion. Before she could formulate a reply, a cold voice cut through the air from the doorway. "That is enough, Beatrice." Both women turned. The Duke was standing there, his face like thunder. His eyes, usually so distant, were blazing with a cold fire. He must have been in his adjoining study and overheard everything. He walked slowly into the room, his gaze fixed on his sister-in-law. "Annalise is my wife," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She is the Duchess of Blackwood, and you will afford her the respect that title commands." Beatrice paled. "Alistair, I heard what you were only doing," he cut her off. "You were insulting my wife in my home. You have overstepped, Beatrice. For years I have been grateful for your presence here, for your help with Rosamond, but your position is not without its limits. This is Annalise's house now. Rosamond is her daughter. You will accept that, or you will find that your welcome here has expired." The threat was unmistakable. Beatrice stared at him, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. She looked from the Duke's implacable face to Annalise's calm one. In that moment she knew she had lost. Her power, built on a foundation of shared grief and her sister's memory, had crumbled. With a choked sob, she turned and fled the room. The silence that descended was profound. Annalise stood by the ladder, her heart pounding. The Duke had defended her. Not with passion, not with any sign of personal affection, but with the cold, irrefutable logic of his position. She was his duchess. An insult to her was an insult to him, to his name, to the order he so prized. It was not a declaration of love, but it was a declaration of alliance. He had chosen her side. He turned to her, the fire in his eyes banking back to its usual cool gray. "I apologize for her behavior. It will not happen again." It was the grief speaking, Annalise found herself saying, surprised at her own impulse to defend the woman who had just wounded her so deeply. "She is afraid of her sister being forgotten." Alistair's expression tightened, the muscles in his jaw clenching. He looked away towards the tall rain-lashed windows. "Forgetting is sometimes a mercy." The words were bleak, filled with a desolation that seemed to suck the very air from the room. He was not just speaking of Beatrice's grief, she realized. He was speaking of his own. He gave her a curt, formal nod. "If you will excuse me." He turned and retreated to his study, closing the heavy oak door behind him with a quiet, definitive click. Annalise was left alone in the library, the scent of old leather and rain filling her senses. She sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. Something had shifted. A line had been drawn. The Duke had publicly, unequivocally sided with her. An uneasy and fragile alliance had been forged in the crucible of Beatrice's anger, and in his final haunted words he had offered her another glimpse into the profound darkness he carried within him. A darkness she was beginning to realize was far deeper and more complex than simple grief. The weeks that followed the confrontation in the library were marked by a subtle but significant change in the household's climate. Lady Beatrice, chastened and subdued, became a less constant presence. Her visits shorter and her mannerisms strained with a resentful politeness. The staff, having witnessed the Duke's public support of his new Duchess, treated Annalise with a new level of deference and respect. She was no longer just a placeholder, she was the established mistress of the manor. The most profound change, however, was in her relationship with Alistair. The wall of formal indifference between them had been breached. It had not crumbled, but there was a crack in it, a small opening through which a tentative connection could grow. He began to seek her out in the evenings, not for conversation, but for company. He would read in the chair opposite hers by the fire in the drawing room, the two of them wrapped in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the whisper of turning pages and the crackle of the flames. It was a companionship of proximity, not of intimacy, but for Annalise it was more than she had ever expected. The true crisis, the event that would shatter the remaining walls between them, arrived with the first snows of winter. It began with a cough from the nursery, then a fever. Rosamond fell ill, her small body racked with a sickness that swiftly grew alarming. The local doctor was summoned, a kindly old man who spoke in grave tones of inflammation of the lungs and prescribed bed rest, steam, and prayer. Annalise did not leave the child's side. She dismissed the governess and the nursemaid, taking on the role of caregiver herself, with Elspeth's quiet assistance. She sat by Rosamond's bedside day and night, bathing her forehead with cool cloths, coaxing sips of water and broth between her pale lips, and speaking to her in a low, soothing voice, even when the child was lost in the delirium of fever. Alistair was a constant, tormented presence. He would stand in the doorway for hours, his face a grey mask of anguish, unable to enter, unable to leave. He looked at his small, struggling daughter, and Annalise saw a terror in his eyes so profound it was almost unwatchable. He was reliving a nightmare. On the third night, the crisis reached its peak. Rosamond's breathing was shallow and ragged, her fever dangerously high. The doctor had been and gone, offering little more than sympathetic platitudes and a new poultice. "It is in God's hands now," he had said, a phrase that offered no comfort at all. Annalise refused to give up hope. She sat holding Rosamond's small hot hand, murmuring stories, prayers, anything that came to mind. Sometime after midnight, Alistair finally crossed the threshold and came to stand by the bed. He looked down at his daughter, then at Annalise, his composure utterly gone, his face ravaged by fear and grief. "This is how it was with Isabella," he whispered, his voice hoarse with unshed tears. "A fever, a weakness, the doctors could do nothing." He sank into the chair on the other side of the bed, burying his face in his hands. The great, unbreachable fortress of the Duke of Blackwood had finally crumbled. "She was not ill, Annalise," he said, his voice muffled. "Not in the way people thought. The illness was here." He tapped his temple. "A melancholy, a deep, abiding sadness that I could not reach, that no one could. She felt she was fading, dwindling. She would stand at the window for hours, staring at nothing." Annalise listened, her heart aching for him, for the woman she had never known, for the child burning with fever between them. She said nothing, knowing that he did not need words, only a witness to a confession he had held for 5 long years. That day, he took a ragged breath. It was raining. She'd been quiet for days. I was in my study, buried in work as always. I thought if I just provided for her, protected her, kept the world at bay, it would be enough. I did not know how to reach her soul. The nurse came, saying the Duchess had gone out. Without a cloak, I found her in the rose garden. She had slipped on the wet stones by the sundial and struck her head. The fall was not severe, but she had been in the cold rain for over an hour. She had no will to fight. The fever took her in 2 days. He looked up at Annalise, his eyes swimming with a guilt so raw it was like an open wound. Everyone believed she died of a tragic illness, but she died of despair and of my neglect. I was so busy building a perfect world for her that I failed to see she was drowning inside it. I failed her, I failed to protect her, and now— His gaze fell upon Rosamond. Now I am failing her again. The confession hung in the air, a truth of devastating weight, the locked wing, the unmentioned name, the cold, impenetrable shell. It was all a monument to this single catastrophic failure. He had not sealed away his grief. He had sealed away his guilt. Annalise reached across the bed, her hand covering his. His skin was ice cold. You are not failing her, Alistair, she said, her voice thick with emotion. She used his name for the first time, the sound of it both strange and perfectly natural. You are here, and I am here. We will not leave her. He looked at their joined hands, then up at her face, his expression one of sheer, exhausted surprise. He seemed to be seeing her clearly for the first time, not as a duchess, not as a solution, but as a woman, a partner in this terrible vigil. He did not pull his hand away. He clung to hers as a drowning man clings to a raft. They sat like that for the rest of the night, 2 solitary souls united in a shared watch, the sleeping child a fragile bridge between them. They did not speak again. There was nothing left to say. The truth was out, lying bare and painful in the flickering candle light of the sick room. Just as the first grey light of dawn began to filter through the windows, something changed. Rosamond stirred. Her eyelids fluttered. Annalise pressed a hand to the child's forehead. The skin was still warm, but the raging, unnatural heat was gone. It was damp with sweat. Her breathing, though still shallow, seemed easier, less ragged. The fever had broken. Alistair let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp of relief. He slumped in his chair, the tension draining out of him, leaving him utterly spent. Annalise felt tears, hot and silent, stream down her own face. They were not tears of sorrow, but of profound, bone-deep relief. Rosamond's eyes opened. They were clear. She looked from her father's ravaged face to Annalise's tear-streaked one. A tiny, weak smile touched her lips. Annalise, she whispered. Her gaze drifted to their joined hands over her bed. She reached out her own small hand and placed it on top of theirs. In the quiet dawn of the sick room, amidst the wreckage of a long-held grief and the aftermath of a desperate fear, a family was being born. The shared vigil had burned away all artifice, all formality. What remained was raw, fragile, and undeniably real. The recovery of a child is a slow, gentle sunrise after a long and terrifying night. Rosamond, though weak, grew stronger each day. The oppressive pall of sickness lifted from Blackwood Manor, replaced by a quiet, hopeful atmosphere. The change in the house, however, was nothing compared to the change between its master and mistress. The wall of formality between Annalise and Alistair was gone, shattered into 1,000 pieces by the hammer of shared fear and confession. They no longer retreated to their separate corners after dinner. Instead, they sat together, sometimes talking, sometimes in a silence that was no longer empty but filled with a new, unspoken understanding. He began to call her Annalise, the name sounding natural and right from his lips. He started to talk to her about the estate, not just issuing directives, but asking for her opinion on tenants, on crop rotation, on plans for a new school in the village. He discovered, to his apparent surprise, that she possessed a keen, practical mind and a deep well of compassion. She, in turn, began to see beyond the cold, autocratic duke to the man beneath, a man burdened by responsibility, haunted by his past, and possessed of a fierce, if misguided, sense of duty. One afternoon, a week after Rosamond was well enough to leave her bed, he came to her while she sat reading in the drawing room. He stood before her, his expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "There is something I must do," he said, his voice low. "And I find I cannot do it alone. I would be grateful if you would accompany me." He led her not to the study or the gardens, but down the long, silent corridor towards the west wing. He stopped before a large, carved oak door and produced a heavy iron key from his pocket. It was the door to Isabella's apartments. The air around it felt still and stale, thick with dust and disuse. He hesitated for a long moment, the key in his hand. "No one has been in here since the day she died," he said, his voice rough. "I had it all locked away. I thought if I could not see it, I could forget. I was a fool." He looked at Annalise. His eyes filled with a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. "I need to let the light in, but I am afraid to do it by myself." "You are not by yourself," she said softly, placing a hand on his arm. He took a deep breath, as if bracing himself, and turned the key in the lock. The sound was unnervingly loud in the silence. He pushed the door open. A wave of stale, close air washed over them. The room beyond was shrouded in white dust cloths, the furniture transformed into ghostly, anonymous shapes. Motes of dust danced in the single beam of light that pierced the gloom from the hallway. It was a tomb, a perfectly preserved monument to a life cut short. Together they moved through the rooms. Alistair, his movements stiff and pained, began to pull the cloths from the furniture. Annalise went to the heavy velvet curtains and drew them back, throwing open the shutters. Sunlight, pale and wintry, flooded the room for the first time in 5 years, illuminating the thick layer of dust that coated every surface. The rooms were beautiful, decorated in a lighter, more feminine style than the rest of the house. There were delicate watercolors on the walls, a harp in one corner, an embroidery frame with a half-finished piece of work still stretched upon it. It was the room of the vibrant, laughing woman society remembered. On a small writing desk, a silver-backed hairbrush lay next to a crystal bottle of perfume. Alistair picked up the bottle, his thumb tracing its outline. "She loved jasmine," he said, his voice thick with memory. He opened it, and a faint, ghostly scent of the flower filled the air. He looked around the room at the relics of the life he had shared with his first wife, and Annalise saw not the sharp agony of fresh grief, but a deep, quiet sadness and acceptance. By speaking of his guilt, by sharing his burden with her, he had begun the slow, arduous process of healing. They worked for hours, not speaking much, but moving with a shared purpose. Annalise carefully gathered the personal items, the brushes, the books, the unfinished embroidery, and placed them in a cedar chest. Alistair opened wardrobes filled with beautiful gowns, the silks and velvets still bright in the sunlight. They were the clothes of a stranger, a ghost. "What should we do with all this?" he asked, his voice heavy. "We should give some to Beatrice," Annalise suggested gently. "She would cherish them, and perhaps the rest could be given to the women in the village. They could be remade, given a new life." He looked at her, his expression filled with a profound gratitude. "A new life," he repeated softly. "Yes, I think she would have liked that." By the time they were finished, the rooms were still Isabella's, but they were no longer a shrine. The dust was gone, the air was fresh, and the sunlight filled every corner. It was a space that held memories, but was no longer imprisoned by them. As they stood in the doorway, ready to leave, Alistair turned to her. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. It was not the brief, formal touch of their wedding day, or the desperate grasp in the sick room. It was a gesture of quiet, profound intimacy. "Thank you, Annalise," he said, his voice low and earnest. "You have brought light back into this house, into my life." He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The touch was electric, a spark of warmth that traveled up her arm and settled deep in her chest. She looked up into his eyes, the color of a winter sky, and saw that the ice had finally, truly melted. In its place was a warmth that was just for her. In that moment, standing at the threshold of the past, Annalise knew that the cold, practical contract they had agreed upon was null and void. She had come to Blackwood Manor as a duchess of convenience, a solution to a problem, but she had found something else entirely. She had found a man's broken heart, and in helping him to mend it, she was beginning to fear she had irrevocably lost her own. The opening of the West Wing marked the true beginning of spring at Blackwood Manor, both outside and within its walls. As the first crocuses and daffodils pushed their way through the thawing earth in the gardens, so too did a new and tender life begin to bloom between Annalise and Alistair. The shared purpose of cleansing the past had forged a bond of deep and resonant intimacy between them. Alistair was a changed man. The transformation was not sudden or dramatic, but a gradual unfurling. The harsh lines around his mouth softened, the permanent tension in his shoulders eased, and most remarkably he began to smile. They were small, rare things at first, a slight upward quirk of his lips when Annalise made a dry observation, or a glimmer of amusement in his eyes when Rosamond said something particularly childlike. But to Annalise each one felt like a miracle. He began to spend time with his daughter, not as a remote, dutiful father, but as an engaged and loving one. He took her for walks in the grounds, his large hand holding her small one. He sat with Annalise in the nursery in the evenings, listening with a soft expression as she read aloud. Annalise would watch them together, a father and daughter rediscovering each other after years of being separated by a wall of unspoken grief. And her heart would ache with a feeling so potent it was almost painful. It was love. The emotion she had long since resigned herself to living without had crept into her life, quiet and patient as her work in the garden, and taken root deep in her soul. She loved him. She loved his quiet strength, his newfound gentleness, the profound vulnerability he had shown only to her. She loved the way his eyes would find hers across a room, a silent communication that spoke volumes more than their earlier stilted conversations. She had entered into this marriage with her eyes wide open, expecting nothing more than a cold and lonely duty. She had never anticipated this slow, sweet, terrifying blossoming of her own heart. One evening in late April, the air soft with the promise of May, he sought her out after dinner. She was where she was most content, in the rose garden. It was almost unrecognizable from the tangled wilderness she had first discovered. The paths were clear, the trellises repaired, and every single rose bush was covered in healthy, vibrant green leaves and the tight, promising buds of forthcoming blooms. The Ina Harkness bush, Rosamond's mother's favorite, was particularly robust, a testament to her care. She was kneeling, gently loosening the soil around its base, when he came and stood beside her. He did not speak for a long time, simply stood watching her, his hands in his pockets. The setting sun cast long, golden rays through the trees, bathing the garden in a warm, gentle light. "It is beautiful, Annalise," he said finally, his voice soft. "You have performed a miracle here." She looked up at him, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "It was not a miracle. It just needed care and patience." "Care and patience," he repeated, his gaze intent on her face. "Two things this house and its master have been sorely lacking for a very long time." He reached down and offered her his hand. She took it, and he gently pulled her to her feet. He did not let go. Instead, he used his other hand to tenderly wipe the smudge of dirt from her cheek, his touch lingering. "When I asked you to marry me," he began, his voice low and earnest, "I offered you a contract, a loveless, practical arrangement. It was the most dishonorable proposal a man could make, and you, with your infinite grace, accepted it to save your family. I offered you a gilded cage, and instead of rattling the bars, you set about tending the garden." He took her other hand, holding both of hers in his warm, strong grip. His eyes, the color of a sky now clear and filled with light, held hers. "That arrangement is no longer enough for me, Annalise. The contract is broken. I look at you, and I do not see the Duchess of Blackwood. I see the woman who faced down my sister-in-law's cruelty with compassion, the woman who nursed my daughter back from the brink of death with tireless devotion, the woman who had the courage to walk into the darkest parts of my past with me and was not afraid, the woman who brought life and light and laughter back to this empty, broken place." His voice grew thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "I have spent 5 years encased in ice, believing myself unworthy of happiness, of love. I believed my heart died with Isabella, but you have shown me that it was only sleeping. You have thawed me, Annalise. You have taught me how to live again." Tears welled in Annalise's eyes, blurring his handsome, earnest face. Her heart was beating so hard she felt it in her throat. "I love you," he said, the words simple, direct, and filled with a profound, unshakable certainty. "I love your quiet strength, your gentle spirit, your incredible, resilient heart. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone." And then, to her utter astonishment, the formidable Duke of Blackwood dropped to one knee on the soft green grass of the rose garden. He looked up at her, his face illuminated by the golden light of the setting sun, and he was no longer a duke, no longer a master of estates and fortunes. He was just a man, vulnerable and open, offering his whole heart. "Lady Annalise Finch, my wife, my duchess," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I am asking you not to honor our contract, but to consent to a new one. Will you have me, not as your duke, but as your husband in truth and in heart, for all the days of our lives? Will you give me the honor of trying to be a man worthy of your love?" The whispers of society faded into nothing. Poor Annalise. The unlovable spinster. They were ghosts, echoes from another life. The woman standing in the garden was not unlovable. She was loved, deeply and completely, by this incredible man kneeling at her feet. Through her tears, she smiled, a radiant, joyous smile that transformed her face. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with happiness. "Oh, Alistair, yes." He rose to his feet, a look of sublime relief and joy on his face. He framed her face with his hands, and for the first time, he kissed her. It was not a chaste, formal kiss. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of desperate longing, of a love that had fought its way through grief and darkness into the light. It was a kiss that sealed not a contract, but a promise of a shared future, a true partnership, a life where patience and care had finally miraculously brought a neglected garden into full and glorious bloom. 2 years later, the laughter of a child was the most common sound to be heard echoing through the once silent halls of Blackwood Manor. The house was no longer a monument to grief, but a home filled with light, warmth, and the bustling energy of a happy family. The West Wing was no longer sealed. Its rooms had been redecorated and were now used for guests, their sunny disposition a testament to the healing that had taken place. Lady Rosamond, now 10 years old, had blossomed. The pale, silent child had been replaced by a bright, inquisitive girl with a ready smile and her father's intelligence. She was the adoring shadow of her stepmother, the woman she now simply and lovingly called Mamma. She spent her afternoons either in the garden with Annalise, her hands as happily dirty as her mother's, or in the library with her father, reading books and asking endless questions which he answered with infinite patience. Lady Beatrice still visited, but her visits were less frequent and far less fraught. She had, in time, come to a grudging acceptance of the new reality. Seeing her niece so happy and her brother-in-law so transformed had softened the sharp edges of her grief and resentment. She and Annalise had reached a place of cool, respectful peace, bound by their shared, though very different love for Isabella's child. Baron Finch, his debts long settled and his dignity restored, was a frequent and welcome guest, his delight in his daughter's happiness a source of constant joy for Annalise. The whispers of London society had long since changed from pity to awe. The story of how the quiet, 40-year-old spinster had tamed and transformed the formidable, cold-hearted Duke of Blackwood had become the stuff of legend. Annalise paid it no mind. Her world was not the ballrooms of London, but the life she had built here, within the grey stone walls of her home. One perfect summer afternoon, Annalise was sitting on the stone bench in the center of the rose garden. It was in its full, breathtaking glory, a riot of color and scent. The air was heavy with the perfume of hundreds of blossoms, the crimson of the Ena Harkness, the blushing pink of the maiden's blush, and dozens of others. She was shelling peas into a bowl in her lap, a simple domestic task that brought her a deep sense of peace. Alistair came to join her, sitting down beside her and draping a comfortable arm around her shoulders. He looked from her serene face to the vibrant garden around them. "Do you remember the day I found you here?" he murmured, his lips close to her ear. "And all I could manage to say was that it was an improvement?" Annalise laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "I remember. At the time, it felt like the most eloquent sonnet ever penned." He smiled, the expression that was now so familiar to her, the one that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "I was a fool, so afraid to feel anything that I had forgotten how. You were the most magnificent improvement a man's life could ever have, and I was too blind to see it." He picked a pea from the bowl and popped it into his mouth. "Rosamond asked me this morning why I had waited so long to marry you." "And what did you tell her?" Annalise asked, her heart full. "I told her the truth," he said, his voice soft and serious. "I told her that I had to wait until I was wise enough to recognize the greatest treasure in the kingdom when she was standing right in front of me." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the rough tweed of his jacket a familiar comfort. She looked at the life she had built, a life she had never dared to dream of. It had not been born of a youthful passion or a grand romance, but had grown slowly, quietly, nurtured by patience, compassion, and the courage to tend to a neglected heart. It was a love that was stronger and deeper for having been so hard won. He tilted her chin up and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that tasted of summer and contentment. It was a kiss that held no ghosts of the past, only the bright promise of their future. In her magnificent blooming garden, surrounded by the life she had coaxed from decay, the Duchess of Blackwood was, at long last, truly and completely home. Dear listener, isn't it a curious thing how we sometimes accept the labels that others place upon us? Too quiet, too old, too set in your ways. Like Annalise, you may have been told in 1,000 subtle ways that your time for blooming has passed. Society has a way of whispering that if love and great adventure haven't found you by a certain chapter, then the book of your life is likely nearing its end. But Annalise's story reminds us of a profound and beautiful truth. A heart does not have a season. It does not wither with the passing of years. In fact, often it is the heart that has known a long winter that is most capable of appreciating the sun. Her strength wasn't in fiery rebellion, but in quiet, patient cultivation. She didn't change who she was to fit the world. She simply began to tend to the small patch of the world she was given, and in doing so, she brought it and herself back to life. Perhaps there is a neglected garden in your own life, a dream you set aside, a talent you stopped nurturing, or a part of your own heart you've allowed to become overgrown with the weeds of doubt and past hurts. What if, Instead of waiting for a grand gesture or a perfect moment, you simply began today with one small act of care. What if you decided to prune away one dead branch of self-criticism or to plant one small seed of hope? You are not a character whose story is already written. You are the gardener. Your worth is not defined by the whispers of the crowd, but by the quiet, resilient strength within you. Never believe that you are unlovable or that your season has passed. Sometimes the most beautiful roses are the ones that bloom latest in the year, their colors made all the more vibrant by the long wait for the sun. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that it is never, ever too late to bloom.